This mod right here is commonly regarded as being pretty important. Grineer units have armor, armor provides damage reduction, and this mod helps remove that armor. Some of the nodes that people very commonly do to farm affinity is Berryhunia, Hydron, and Adaro and Setna. Now this is a level 30 to 40 mission, this is also a level 30 to 40 mission, and this is 32 to 36. Let's take and use one of the units that most commonly spawn on Berryhunia as an example. The Elite Lancer. This guy has 200 alloy armor and a base level of 15. Now if we take the formula for calculating armor, this one right here, and input those values, base armor of 200, base level of 15, and then we'll take right between 30 and 40, and we'll say 35. That gives an armor rating of 389. Then we can take this other formula that the game uses for calculating damage reduction and see how much damage reduction that gives him. 56.5%. So this means that he takes less than half of the damage being dealt if there are no corrosive projections present on Berryhunia. Now this damage reduction will of course go down. We reduce armor by 30%, goes down to 47.5. Reduce it by 60 and it's down to 34. Reduce it by 90% and it's down to 11.4. And obviously the damage reduction goes away completely if you have all 4 corrosive projections. So this is very nice, but where can we apply this practically in game? Let's say that I want to farm Affinity on Berryhunia and I want to buff the damage of another frame with Rhino. Now, what I see a lot of people doing, and what I could do, is I could take Steel Charge, and then I could throw on, say, Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, and Intensify. Now, this gives Raw a buff of 142% damage. But let's say that the 3 other people I mean, in my party have corrosive projection. So that means if I take Steel Charge, the enemies have 11.5% damage reduction. Now let's see how much of a damage increase corrosive projection would get us. And the answer to that is about 13%. So let's see how big a Raw we would need for a build that uses corrosive projection to be better than the one we just made with Steel Charge. That gave us a buff of 242%. So we'll solve, and then we'll see that the buff we need is 114%. Can we get that? We could do this. Right here. We lose 30% power strength. But we sure do maintain a buff above 114%. We're at 127%. So this is in fact much better than the build that contains Steel Charge and Intensify. Now, this obviously doesn't mean that you should talk down to or be a dick to people who either doesn't have this mod or chooses not to use it. It just means you should be wary of how powerful it is. Let's take some missions where it's a lot more relevant than on Berryhunia. Now these sorties are with Infested, but let's say they were Grineer. If we take Sortie 3, that has a starting level of 80. And then go back in here. Let's say there are no corrosive projections. And the level is 80. Now that gives Elite Lancers a damage reduction of about 85%. That's a lot more significant than around 50%. And now, let's take one of the most extreme examples and say that we're dealing with a heavy gunner. That's a base armor of 500, a base level of 8, and now let's say that it's a level 100 heavy gunner. That's a lot more armor, and that results in a damage reduction of 96%. Here's the thing you should know about armor, by the way. Due to the way that it scales, putting on a single corrosive projection here only chips a little bit off the damage reduction. Now that, very roughly speaking, was still worth about plus 50% damage dealt, but it's still a very insignificant dent in the damage reduction. You go up to 2 corrosive projections and you're still at 90%. You're still looking at around plus 40% damage for a corrosive projection, but the point is the damage reduction is still there. You go all the way down to 70 with the third corrosive projection. We went from 90 to 70 damage reduction. That's tripling your damage dealt. This means that the value of corrosive projection against these levels of Grineer becomes more the more corrosive projections you have. And obviously the most valuable one is then gonna be the last one that removes 70% of the damage reduction. That's a damage increase. 100 divided by 29 because it's 71. It's a damage multiplier of 3.44 from putting on the last corrosive projections. Now, the important thing to notice here is that when we're, as I said before, when we're dealing with these high level enemies, the more corrosive projections you have, the more each one becomes worth. Where when we were dealing with the Elite Lancers on Berryhunia, it was working the other way around. The first corrosive projection was the most valuable, and then they decreased in value as we put on more. Do whatever you want with this information. I just think it's good to know.